stop bringing your outboard to the mechanic. Today, we're gonna be talking about my top 10 issues that I see in small outboards like this and how to fix them. Yes, that's right. I have fixed countless of these small outboards and I have seen so many different types of issues. However, I put together my top 10 most common problems that I see on small outboards like this, and I'm gonna show you how to fix them. This list is made only for engines which have good compression. If you guys are having problems with your outboard and you have not compression checked it yet, that should always be the first thing you do, always. This list is for motors that we know have good compression and should be able to run with the right adjustments. All right guys, one thing to note, this list is not ranked in order of how common the issues are, but I will be going in order of how I personally diagnose an engine. What I mean by that, when I get a new outboard I know nothing about, the first thing I always check is compression. We already talked about that, knock it off the list. The second thing you should always confirm in an outboard that you know nothing about is the spark. So the first few things on my list here are the most common reasons why I see these outboards not having any spark. And without further ado, the first thing on my list are the spark plugs. I like to follow the KISS methodology when I'm working on these engines. It means keep it simple, stupid. So we want to check the simple stuff first, guys. I show you guys how to confirm spark on almost all of my other videos, so I'm not going to do it now. If you have confirmed that you have no spark on your outboard, keep it simple, stupid. Check the easy stuff first. The spark plugs extend inside the cylinder and is actually what creates the spark that is ignited and propels the engine. They're extremely important. So let's pop one of these out and take a closer look. Alright guys, here is your typical spark plug. This end here is where the rubber boot coming from the ignition coil fits on. And this is where the actual spark is created. Yes, you can test them with a multimeter to see if they're working properly, but these are a regular maintenance item anyways. If you really are so unsure about a spark plug that you feel the need to test it, go spend $5 on a new one. With that being said, there is also one very important thing about these that you have to be able to measure and know. So bear with me, I don't really know the technical terminology, but this little black hoo-ha underneath, and then we got this long bent over doohickey right here. The gap in between them is where the spark jumps, and it's measured and it's very specific. You have to have the correct gap that your engine calls for. We have a little spark plug gap tool you can also buy at your local auto parts store for probably $1 or $2. The side of it goes from very thick down to very thin with the proper measurement. So all you gotta do is look up online or in an owner's manual how big your gap needs to be for your spark plug, and then you can slide this in between the doohickey and the hoo-ha and make it however big or small it needs to be. And no, new spark plugs are not always gapped properly out of the box, so when you buy new, make sure they're gapped accordingly. I know this is very simple and a lot of you already know this stuff, but always check the simple stuff first. Might save you some headaches and some dollars. You got new spark plugs, they're gapped properly. We can probably scratch that off our list of why our engine is not sparking. With our spark plugs taken care of, all we gotta do is follow this line from the spark plug, and it brings us right to my number 2 most common issue I see with these things, the ignition coils. Yeah, so everything on this list is common, but this is one of those ones that I see more often than others. Your ignition coil right here, very, very common for that to be an issue. Every small outboard is different. Some of them have one giant ignition coil like this that fires both spark plugs. Others have 2 separate ignition coils, one for each cylinder. Alright, this is not the same ignition coil as the one on my model engine because that one does not have any issues with it, but this one did. This was from a previous one that I removed. Yes, you can look up online ohm specs and test the resistance of these with a multimeter. However, from my experience, these are really easy to visually inspect and visually diagnose. These parts last a long time, guys, but they do eventually go bad. There is this like rubberized gel coating on the back, which eventually will dry rot. It'll crack, and moisture does not play well with electronics. So I don't know if you can see it, but the entire border has been cracked and dry rotted. There are cracks extending through the middle. All you got to do is check for cracking, any signs of dry rotting on this coating here. Any cracks on the plastic are bad news. You should always replace these if you see cracks where moisture could get into them. If you're struggling with spark on your outboard and the backs of your ignition coils are not looking good, this is probably your primary suspect. Alright, our spark plugs and ignition coil have been covered. Now on to number 3. Now number 3 is going to be a little bit split depending on what year of outboard you have. So I'm going to call it your power pack / points system is number 3. When it comes to generating spark, your older outboards will have points underneath the flywheel that you'll need to measure and set. Newer ones will have a power pack. The way you diagnose and test these systems varies incredibly on make, model, year, everything. Ignition coils and spark plugs are more of a one-size-fits-all, so I could show you those, but for the remainder of the ignition system, guys, it'd be really hard for me to give you any valuable information unless you have this exact outboard. But I'm about to drop a secret right now. Outboard mechanics are gonna hate me for this one. I'm gonna put you guys on some free game. If there is one book that you should purchase in your lifetime, it's this. Guys, you need to buy this book called Practical Outboard Ignition Troubleshooting Guide by CDI Electronics. In no way am I being paid to say this by CDI. This book is the holy grail for diagnosing spark issues on your outboard. You may be able to find PDFs of it online for free, I don't know, or order the book online. It literally does not matter what make, model, year, horsepower your engine is. CDI will have an exact step-by-step guide on how to troubleshoot spark issues on your outboard. Outboard mechanics, car mechanics, they're all very good at what they do. However, they are not wizards. They don't know everything about every part. They have good documentation that they read and they understand, and you should too. And with those 3 problems having been talked about, that basically covers all of the ignition system, all of your spark woes and troubles. I'm not gonna count this as an official problem, but if your engine's not sparking, this should really be the first thing you check. Check your kill switch, make sure it's on. Let's move on to fuel and take a look at number 4. The fuel system is the biggest offender over all of issues on your outboard, and there's a lot of things that could go wrong in a lot of places, so let's dive in right now. And without any further delay, number 4 on my list are leaks in the fuel lines. Alright guys, so your fuel system's made up of a few key components. You got your tank, you got your primer bulb, you've got the line, and you got where it connects to the engine. Once fuel gets up to the engine, it goes through a series of lines. It goes likely through a fuel pump, and it ends up at the carburetor. This number 4 here, fuel line leaks, is extremely common. You will have fuel lines on the outboard itself that become dry rotted and cracked. It lets air in, or you could have loose hose clamps on your fuel line. A lot of sources of leaks here to make sure you check. So, quick fuel tank checklist. Make sure you have good fresh fuel with no water. Make sure your cap is vented. This has brought grown men to tears before. They have not vented their caps. Now, the purpose of your primer bulb is to manually suction fuel from the tank all the way up to the carburetor. Your fuel pump cannot pump fuel without the engine running. So to initially start the engine, you have to manually pull the gasoline up to the engine itself. So to find leaks, just pump the primer bulb and watch. Look at every area of the fuel line between the tank and the carburetor. Watch for drips. You should not see fuel dripping out anywhere. It should be a very tight, airtight circuit. And another thing is you gotta listen. Listen very carefully. You should not hear the sound of air spewing out anywhere. That is a sign that air is getting into your fuel. That's not good either. You should be able to pump the primer bulb until you can no longer squeeze the bulb. That means it is fully primed. The gasoline's in the carburetor. Can't force any more gas in. The whole system's full and no air is getting in. Some key points that I see leaks, guys. Anywhere where you have a quick connector, anywhere where you have hose clamps, especially where the fuel enters the motor. These are very common places to find fuel leaks. Also where the fuel lines actually enter the carburetor, also very common. And these are really easy to replace, guys. If you've got somewhere that's dry rotted, cut, broken, leaking, pull the fuel line off, bring a piece down to your local auto parts store so they can know the correct diameter and get you a new one for a couple bucks. All right, guys, now on to number 5. we have the fuel pump. Extremely common source of issues. Anytime I buy an old outboard, I almost always find a broken fuel pump and need to replace it. So how do you know if your fuel pump is bad? Well, you can pressure test it. A lot of people don't have the tools to do a pressure test on a fuel pump. I would not expect any of you guys to have the tools available to pressure test a fuel pump, so we're not even gonna talk about that. So we're gonna talk about some old school ways to tell if you got a bad fuel pump. Number one, your engine runs, but it won't stay running. So one of the best old school tests to find out if your fuel pump is bad, after the engine starts up and before it dies, just pump the primer bulb. Pump the primer bulb continuously, and if that keeps the engine running longer than if you weren't doing that, it's 99% of the time a fuel pump issue, because you are manually pumping fuel into the outboard. If you can keep your outboard running while you're pumping the primer bulb, but it won't run if you're not there doing that, you probably got a fuel pump issue. It doesn't matter the make or model, guys. These are all very similar. 99% of the time, it's just a couple bolts holding it in, and it's one fuel line coming from the tank and the other fuel line leading to the carburetor. Pretty simple, one in, one out. All you gotta do, take the fuel lines off, unbolt the fuel pump, pop a new one in, and reconnect the fuel lines, and you'll be good to go. Yes, you can rebuild fuel pumps. You can buy rebuild kits. Question, should I buy a new one? Should I rebuild it? This really depends on your budget and your willingness to work with a bunch of very frustratingly small parts for a long period of time. If you don't have a lot of mechanical experience working on stuff, I highly encourage you to just buy a brand new fuel pump already pre-built. Just take the old one off, pop the new one on. If you do go the rebuild route, one thing to note, most of these fuel pumps operate with a rubber diaphragm and a bunch of small springs that open and close the diaphragm. If you don't know that and you break into a fuel pump and you're not ready for it, the springs are going to explode and parts are going to go everywhere. So everything is being held in there under pressure by springs. Make sure you're ready for that. All right, guys, that is the first half of my list. We still have some massive problem causing parts to cover, but it's almost kickoff time on NFL Sunday. So we gotta go have a quick word with today's sponsor. That's right, baby, go Steelers. And now time to talk about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the #1 daily fantasy sports app in the game right now. Now you know. Prize Picks is insanely fun, really easy to play, and gives you a shot at making some money while watching sports. Guys, all we're doing is scrolling through, picking 2 to 6 players, and entering in whether we think they're gonna get more or less than their Prize Picks projections. And you can 100x your money. Imagine this carburetor is your money. Now imagine 100 of them. That's way more carburetors than you started with. I just submitted my lineup for this Sunday. Let me show you who I'm taking. Lamar Jackson is not throwing for 241 yards on my Steelers defense. We're taking less than for Lamar. Although death, taxes, and Derrick Henry to have at least 1 touchdown, we're taking more on Derrick Henry TDs. Also taking more on Joe Mixon's rushing yards, and taking less than on Amon-Ra St. Brown's receiving yards. If I get all my picks right on this 4-pick lineup, my $100 is gonna turn into $800. Prize Picks also has a brand new feature they are calling Live Squares. That's right, you can make picks mid-game on live player projections. That's sick. Go to prizepicks.com and sign up using code BOATBUSTERS. When you do this, all you gotta do is play a lineup of $5 or more and you're gonna get $50 for free. Do not delay. Click the link in the description. Daily fantasy sports made easy. Now back to the video. All right, guys, we are back, and as you can see, we have switched our outboard model for number 6 and 7. And the reason for that is because number 6 and 7 on my list have to do with the carburetor. Really, the only reason I'm switching the model outboard here is because the old ones are a lot easier to get to and don't have all the plastic BS that you have to take off. So yeah, I'm gonna use the older carburetor to show you number 6 and 7. Hate plastic. The carburetor's purpose: fuel is suctioned up from the fuel tank, it enters the carburetor mixes the fuel with air, turns it into a mist, and shoots it into the cylinders where the spark plugs ignite them, and that's how an internal combustion engine works. Let's pull these couple fuel lines off, take the nuts off, and pull our carburetor out. Here is a standard small outboard carburetor. Only took me a couple minutes to remove. It's really not a big deal at all. Guys, as I said, number 6 and 7 are both within this guy, and let me tell you something. The carburetor is responsible for an engine not running at all or not running well, probably 85 95% of the time. Guys, these things need maintenance, and a lot of times they don't get maintained and some things happen. So let's break into this and talk about it right now. All right, guys, first things first, if you don't know much about carburetors or have never worked on one before, I know this may look intimidating, it might look a little daunting, but it's really not. So let's go ahead and break it down. First thing I always do when I pull a carb is I'm going to remove the bowl, and we'll talk about the purpose in a bowl here in just 1 second. All right, guys, all my screws have been removed, so this is always my first step when breaking down a carburetor, is to remove the bowl. There are a few key components inside of a carburetor. Here we have the float. And why is it called a float? Because that's literally what it does, it floats. When the carburetor is mounted on an engine, it sits like this. The bowl is facing down toward the ground. What happens is fuel is pumped through this nozzle and it fills up inside the bowl. This bowl right here actually fills up with fuel from your tank. When gasoline fills up the carburetor, the float begins to, well, float. Now the float is basically pushing on a very small needle that's seated into this valve here. So what's happening is when the float is down like this, that means the engine wants more fuel. There's a valve that is open when the float is down. Fuel is allowed to pass through. When the bowl gets full of gasoline, the float floats up and closes. It closes the valve. So the entire time your engine is running, the float is opening and closing and making room for more gasoline, feeding gasoline to the engine, etc. And that, guys, is essentially all that's happening with a carburetor. Is when the engine wants more fuel, it allows more fuel from the tank. When it's got enough, it closes it off. To talk about specific issues inside the carburetor, number 6 is going to be dirt in your jets. That is the number one reason outboards don't run well, is dirt in your fuel jets. So let's break this down. Remove our gasket. I'm going to pull the pin out here, keep track of that, and that way the float can just come up and you'll see the needle that I was talking about earlier. If for any reason you have dirt in your fuel tank, gunk that you didn't see, it can travel all the way up into the carburetor and jam up these little openings. They're so small, a lot of fuel is pushed through such a small hole, that's why they call them jets, that it turns it into a mist, and that's how it shoots into the engine. So very common for dirt to clog those up. So guys, all we're doing here is anything that unscrews, we are pulling it out and setting it aside. Anything here, pulling it out, setting it aside. Down here, we got another low-speed jet. We are unscrewing everything that has the ability to be unscrewed. This is your low-speed needle adjustment. We're gonna remember that term for later. And this includes the top plate as well. Let me get this off and I'll get right back to you. And don't make this process intimidating. This is something fun. It's like adult Legos, right? If you're concerned about not knowing how to put it back together, just take pictures every step of the way. Set your phone up so you know how everything goes back together. It's not that hard. All right, and with the top plate off, there's a gasket. Pull that off. This is just plastic. A lot of times it's metal, but you know, whatever. All right, now that you've unscrewed everything that can be unscrewed, you are left with just the bare skeleton of your carburetor. You'll notice there are a lot of small holes, orifices, jets, etc. And no, I don't really know exactly what this is for or what that is for. It doesn't really matter. Here's what you got to do to fix problem number 6. You got to look through your jets. If there's any cloggage at all, you've got to clean it out. This is Old Faithful. Carb throttle body cleaner. And guys, it's really simple. Anywhere this straw can fit, stick it in there and blast it. Blast it down every hole, every orifice that you can find on this thing. Every jet that you remove, spray this carb cleaner through it. Make sure everything is crystal clear and clean on this. Every part, every gasket, coat it, spray it with this, and keep it in a nice, neat area. That's number 6, guys. Clogged jets. This is your solution. Take everything apart, get it clean, get everything unclogged, and then reassemble it. Obviously, check the condition of your gaskets. If they're torn, if they're broken, replace those, but that's not really something on the list. What is on the list is your float. This is number 7. So your float orientation, number 7 on my common problem list. So let's start putting this back together and I'll show you what I'm talking about. A stuck float is kind of what I'm referring to here. So what that means is a stuck float is when it comes up, your engine bowl is now drained of gasoline, but the float does not drop back down. like it should. If I'm not holding this up, this should always just fall right back down. A lot of times you'll find a float that'll get stuck, and what that is due to is this little needle inside of here sometimes can get worn. It might have some gunk in there, something like that causes this float to stick in the up position. And the issue with that is when this is stuck in the up position, your outboard will not draw in more fuel and to keep it running, and it will die. You have to make sure the needle's in good shape and that the float is working properly and that gravity is doing what it should be with the float. Another part of number 7 that is very common that a lot of people don't check. We are talking about the float's orientation. There's a line on your float. This line is about where it should sit, level with this top part of the metal casing here. That's how you know it is sitting level. If it's not, this little metal tab is what you will adjust up or down, whichever way it needs to go. A lot of times if this tab gets bent, the float will be really kinked one way or another. That's not good. It has to be nice and level. Use that line. Make sure that you adjust it so where it's sitting flush as it should be. That's number 7. Okay guys, for number 8, I have changed the model engine again to this beautiful Johnson 9.5. This is one of my favorite outboards of all time, really for no reason other than it was the first outboard I ever owned and had the opportunity to learn how to work on these engines with. So number 8 is very important, and it should immediately follow after you clean and rebuild your carburetor, as we just talked about. So number 8, your idle adjustment. Guys, what this knob does is it controls the ratio of fuel to air that the carburetor makes in its mixture and spits into your outboard. Your low speed idle adjustment is so incredibly crucial to your outboard running well. When people are trying to figure out why their outboard won't idle, why it won't run well, it is so commonly overlooked. It's oftentimes looked at as a way to really tune it from idling okay to idling great, which it is, but I have worked on plenty of outboards which would not even start or run at all unless that dial was perfectly dialed in. Outboards are machines, but they have personalities and they have minds of their own sometimes. Some outboards won't run at all unless it's a little richer, a little more fuel, a little less air. Some outboards prefer to run slightly more lean, less fuel, more air. There is no one size fits all setting for this, but there's a good place to start, so let's talk about it. Basically, this knob will always be connected to the screw that enters the carburetor, the low speed needle. And we're talking about this piece here, the part that I told you to remember earlier. When you are unscrewing that screw, aka turning this to the left, you are allowing more fuel into the mixture and less air. That is what we call making it richer with fuel. When you are turning it clockwise, you are tightening the screw. You are allowing less fuel into the carburetor and more air into the carburetor. That is what we call making it more lean. After a carburetor rebuild, you need to screw in your low speed needle all the way until it just barely seats, and then typically back it out maybe a turn to a turn and a quarter. That's usually a good starting point where most outboards will start, and then you can fine tune it from there. After you get it to the point where your outboard will start, it's really as simple as turning it a quarter turn at a time, giving the outboard 20-30 seconds to catch up to the adjustment you made and see how the engine reacts. Does it sound better? Does it sound worse? If it gets worse, turn it back the other way. Small adjustments and giving the outboard time to catch up to the adjustment you made is key. So that is number 8, your low speed idle adjustment. It is so crucial and very often overlooked, so don't overlook it. All right, we are 8 points in, and after the first 8, guys, 99% of the time, if everything checks out, you should have a running outboard. There are still problems that an outboard can have even after it's running, and that problem is that it's not cooling properly. Outboards are not like cars where it has a contained system of coolant that circulates through and keeps it cool. Engineers said, well, since outboards are always going to be in water, why don't we just pump water from the lake through the engine to cool it? It's a genius idea. There are 2 main components to the water pumping cooling system of an outboard that we're going to talk about today, both of which cause tons of problems. I see it all the time, and both of which should be regular maintenance, so let's talk about them real quick. So down at the bottom of your outboard, you have what is called the lower unit. Inside here, through this tube or through holes in the side, water is sucked into the motor. So what is sucking that water up? There is a little rubber fan inside of here called an impeller. It looks like this. As the engine operates, it turns the drive shaft, which then spins the gears and in turn spins your propeller. That is how you scoot across the lake. The impeller, which is not the same as the propeller, the impeller is a rubber fan that sits on the drive shaft. So the impeller sits on the drive shaft and it spins with it as the motor operates. The rubber fan is what creates the force that pulls the water up. So let's take a look at the impeller. First thing you always want to do before you drop the lower unit is put your outboard in reverse. Gotta be in reverse. The first thing you have to do to drop the lower unit on any outboard is there are some main bolts here that connect the lower unit to the rest of the engine. So you gotta pop those out, and then there's one more small step that I'll show you after we get those out. Okay, with the removal of the final bolt, we should now be able to shimmy this down a ways. Now, inside the lower unit connecting to the gears, there's a thin metal rod, and then there's another metal rod extending from your shifter, where you shift it up top. So that controls the gears. That means there has to be something connecting that to that will need taken off. There is typically a little metal bracket that connects the two rods with a screw holding it in place. And be very careful, you want to make sure that you are holding the lower unit in place when you take the screw out, because after you take that out, there's nothing preventing this from falling down. So make sure you hold everything together while you are removing that screw. Lucky for me, this engine only requires a flathead screwdriver. Some of them use Allen keys, and I think any engineer who made this an Allen key has a special spot reserved for them, you know where. All right, I'm gonna come in here with some needle nose and pull the bolt out, again while supporting the lower unit. Here's the bolt, and now there should be nothing stopping us from pulling out the lower unit, just like that. And you know, an outboard without a lower unit is like me without you as a subscriber. I just feel like I'm missing something. Missing my other half. So if you're enjoying the tips, liking the content, you should click that button for me. I'd appreciate it. Here is your lower unit. Pretty simple, nothing crazy going on. This here is your water pump housing. The impeller is inside of this housing. So we just got 4 little screws that we need to unscrew here with a flathead screwdriver, and I'll be back when I got that done. All right, after the screws are removed, all we have to do is slide the housing off of the drive shaft. And there it is. As you can see, that is your impeller, this rubber fan. To remove the impeller, we're just going to slide it up the drive shaft, same way we did with the pump housing. One thing to note though, if you'll look, you'll see a little notch in the side of the impeller. There is what we call a key in there, a little piece of metal. That is what binds the impeller to the crankshaft, and it is very imperative that you don't lose it. It's very important. So carefully slide the impeller up, and you'll see right here in the side of the shaft is your key. Don't lose this. And here it is, guys. Here is your impeller. When these things come brand new, the fins are actually straight, and over time, being inside the housing and spinning, they curl up like this. This is the single most important piece of maintenance you could ever do to your outboard. If you don't change your spark plugs every season, fine. Maybe a spark plug breaks. So what? You paddle back to the dock, you spend $5 on a new one. If you hold off on keeping this little guy maintained, this little $15 rubber fan is all that is preventing your outboard from exploding. Service these regularly. It is crucial. Now, when you put these guys back on, you want to make sure your key is in that little hole in the shaft where it was before. And then make sure that when you put the impeller down, there's a little notch right there. Make sure that lines up with the key. And guys, the purpose of the key is that if the impeller is just sitting here, the drive shaft will spin but the impeller would not spin with it. There's nothing connecting the two. We want the impeller to spin when the motor's on, so the key is how we ensure that the impeller spins in unison with the drive shaft. Very important, your engine won't pump water without it. All right guys, number 10 on the list is another one that I see break all the time, but it drives people insane. So what happens is someone's outboard stops pumping water through the telltale, they replace the impeller, it still doesn't pump water. What's going on? These break all the time, and number 10 on the list is the thermostat. Every outboard has a thermostat, guys. This one in particular is here where these 3 bolts are. This Game Fisher, their thermostat is underneath this thing on the front. This Johnson has it again with the 3 bolts. You'll need to look at where they are, but on this one it's right here. So let's pop these 3 bolts out. And inside here is your thermostat. So what does the thermostat do? This is temperature regulated. So essentially the water must come to the thermostat first. When the outboard reaches a certain operating temperature, this does not allow water to cool the engine unless the outboard is at a certain temperature. So this opens and closes depending on the operating temperature of the motor. A lot of times this gets jammed in the closed position. So even though you have an impeller that's pumping water up, if this is jammed shut with dirt or rocks or sticks or whatever, corrosion, water will not be able to circulate and pump throughout the outboard. So this is extremely important to the proper cooling of your motor. I wouldn't say these break as often as your impeller, but number 10, your thermostat. I fix them all the time. I see them jammed all the time. It's very important that you have a good, properly working thermostat. Now, it's also another common question I get. Why do you have a thermostat in the first place? Wouldn't you just want your outboard cooling all the time? Can I just remove my thermostat and just allow water to pump all the time? And the answer to that is no. And the reason you need this is because an outboard running at too cold of an operating temperature can be just as bad as an outboard running at too hot of an operating temperature. They're not expensive. Buy a new one, pop it in and out. It's 3 bolts. It's so easy. But there it is, guys. Those are my top 10 most common problems with these small outboards that I see all the time. Let me know in the comments, did I miss anything? Are there other common problems that you guys experience with these motors? Let me know. I'll highlight them in the comments. I want this to be a place where everyone can learn something new. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.